The fall of a city is loud, steel on stone, fires climbing into the sky, the screams of men swallowed by the noise of war. But what happens after the walls break is quiet. On the dawn of May 29, 1453, as the armies of Mehmed II surged through the shattered gates of Constantinople, the last defenders fell, one by one. Yet beneath the burning towers, in cellars and sanctuaries, women huddled together in silence. Some clutched small icons, others held their children. All of them listened, not for victory or defeat, but for footsteps, because they knew what those footsteps meant. And this is the part of conquest we rarely speak about. The maps show borders, the chronicles praise the generals, but the most enduring stories were whispered in the shadows, the fate of the women who survived the siege. This pattern was not Ottoman, not Mongol, not Timurid, Mughal, Crusader, or Roman. It was older than any empire, and survived long after their ruins turned to sand. When a city fell, men died quickly, but women stepped into a different kind of war, one without armies, one without choices, one where survival depended on the whims of the victors. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Every empire wrote laws about the treatment of captives, but when the walls came down, laws meant little, only power did. If you pause the story here, you might almost believe this was a single tragedy, one city, one conquest. But it wasn't. The same pattern echoed from Constantinople to Delhi, from Baghdad to Samarkand, from Kiev to Antioch. To understand what truly awaited the women of conquered cities, we must step inside that moment, when the gates break, the soldiers surge forward, and a civilization collapses in a single breath, because conquest doesn't end with victory. For the women who survived, that is where it begins. Long before an army storms a city, its women already know what the future holds. History taught them, rumors reminded them, and the silence of their leaders confirmed it. In every civilization, Greek, Roman, Persian, Arab, Turkic, Mongol, Christian, Hindu, women understood one truth: once the walls fall, they become part of the spoils. The vocabulary changed from empire to empire, but the meaning did not. Romans called captives presa. Medieval European armies spoke of rights of sacking. Early Islamic jurists wrote rules for sabi, female captives taken in war. Mongol chronicles describe how women were distributed by rank. Timurid records mention captives entered into households or sold. None of these terms were graphic. All of them were final. But before the conquest, there was fear, the quiet, heavy kind that grows in the days before a siege collapses. Women gathered food, hid valuables, walled off rooms, and sometimes dug chambers beneath the floor. Families barred doors not to keep soldiers out, but to delay them long enough for bargaining, ransom, or escape. Byzantine accounts from 1453 describe how churches filled with women praying through the night. Persian accounts of Delhi in 1739 note that entire households burned documents and jewelry to conceal wealth that might attract soldiers. During the Mongol invasions, entire villages fled into forests because they knew that staying meant captivity. This wasn't imagination, it was preparation. And the laws, they rarely helped. Every empire created rules governing war captives, limits, restrictions, processes for ransom or integration. These laws looked humane on parchment, written by men far from the battlefield. But laws written in calm rarely survive the fury of conquest. In reality, three forces always decided the women's fate. 1. The discipline of the army. 2. The culture of the conqueror. 3. The chaos of the first few hours. If an army was tightly controlled, as with the Ottomans after the initial sack, the fate of women shifted from random violence to systematic redistribution. If the army was undisciplined, as at Delhi under Nader Shah, everything dissolved into terror and massacre. But regardless of the empire, the moment discipline cracked, soldiers moved first, and the first people they sought were the city's women. Because to the victors, women symbolized wealth, status, vengeance, or opportunity. To the vanquished, they symbolized everything left to lose. And this was only the beginning. Because when the gates finally break, Something far older than law takes over. Something empires tried to regulate, but never truly controlled: the right of the sword. When a city finally falls, there is no ceremony, no order, no justice. Only the raw, unfiltered instinct of the army that has spent weeks, sometimes months, starving, bleeding, and burying its dead outside the walls. And in those first hours, nothing is more dangerous than a victorious soldier with no one left to fight. This is the moment historians quietly call the right of the sword, not an official law, but a reality older than writing. Once the defenders were killed and the gates secured, everything inside the city belonged to the victors: gold, horses, land, and yes, people. Across empires, the pattern was eerily consistent. When the Ottomans entered Constantinople in 1453, soldiers surged through the streets marking houses with chalk to claim what was inside. Byzantine chroniclers describe soldiers tearing open doors, seizing goods, and forcing families into the streets to be divided or marched away. Navies blocked the harbor to prevent escape, not of armies, but of captives. When the Mongols sacked cities like Merv and Nishapur, chroniclers wrote that the women were taken by rank, meaning nobles chose first, officers second, common soldiers last. It was brutally systematic, a hierarchy of possession. When crusaders captured Antioch or Jerusalem, the chronicles of both sides recorded the same scene: chaos, claiming, and the division of captives among knights and lords. And in Delhi, when Nader Shah's Persians stormed the city in 1739, the early looting spiraled into such horrific disorder that Nader personally ordered a massacre to reimpose control. Tens of thousands died in hours. Those who survived, especially the women, were seized for ransom, enslavement, or transport back to Persia. The first hours after a siege are not shaped by policy. They are shaped by emotion: revenge for fallen comrades, desire disguised as victory, greed sharpened by hunger, chaos amplified by triumph. You can almost imagine the sound: not battle, but doors splintering, families crying, soldiers shouting commands as they divide people like treasure. Women in religious garments, women from noble families, women hidden in cellars or disguised in peasant clothing. It rarely mattered. Soldiers knew that in these first hours, no one outranked them. Even officers hesitated to intervene, knowing that attempting to restrain exhausted, blood-soaked men could trigger mutiny. This is the part of conquest that empires tried hardest to control because it reflected not discipline, but chaos. Mehmed II famously allowed 3 days of plunder after taking Constantinople, a standard clause in medieval warfare. Yet even he moved swiftly to end the uncontrolled sacking when it threatened his long-term plans for the city. The truth is simple: chaos benefits soldiers, order benefits empires, and once a city was fully secured, once the bloodlust faded and commanders tightened their grip, the fate of the women shifted again. The captives that had been claimed in the frenzy of the first hours now became part of something colder, more structured, a system that stretched from palace to marketplace. But before we step into that system, pause here. This moment, these first hours, were the most unpredictable, the most feared, the most life-altering. For many women, their entire future was decided not by emperors, but by the first soldier who broke through their door. And if you're wondering how empires justified it, the answer is harsh. They didn't need to. Victors did not explain. Victors simply took. But as the chaos begins to settle, a new force emerges: bureaucracy. And with it, the state arrives to reshape the lives of the captives into something far more organized and far more permanent. For most women taken in conquest, captivity meant disappearance. A life uprooted, renamed, repurposed. But history carries a strange and often unsettling irony. Some of the most powerful women in imperial history began as captives. This wasn't common. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't redemption. It was a consequence of how empires absorbed talent, beauty, and political usefulness into their highest circles. And in the Ottoman, Timurid, Mongol, and Mughal worlds, this pattern left deep marks on dynasties. The Ottoman court, where captivity became influence, The Ottoman Empire provides the clearest window into this phenomenon. Its imperial harem wasn't a place of simple indulgence, it was a political institution, a training ground, and often a battlefield of influence. Many of the most influential women in Ottoman history entered the palace as captives from conquered or tributary regions. Circassian, Georgian, Armenian, Greek, Balkan. They weren't prisoners chained in darkness. They were absorbed into a world of discipline, politics, education, and proximity to power, and in rare cases, they rose from uncertainty to command extraordinary authority. Hujil, Sultan, Roxlana, is the most famous example. Captured in her youth, likely from the Ruthenian territories, she entered the palace with no certainty of survival, let alone influence, yet she became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, reshaped court politics, influenced foreign policy, and laid foundations for the period historians later called the Sultanate of Women. But she was not an exception, she was part of a pattern. Some captives became Sulema, Hasaki sultans, favored consorts, builders of charitable complexes, mosques, schools, hospitals. Their origins rarely mattered. Their influence absolutely did. The Timurid and Mughal courts, power behind the throne. In Central and South Asia, similar dynamics unfolded. Timurid's empire, and later the Mughal Empire, frequently incorporated women from conquered regions into elite households. Some became mothers of princes, shaping succession struggles. Others became cultural patrons, educators, or political advisors. Jahangir's court mentions several such women, educated, strategic, and influential within the palace's inner circles. Their lives began in conquest, but their legacies reshaped dynasties. And yet, this was the smallest fraction. A thin sliver of fate reserved for the rare few who entered the highest courts with the right combination of intelligence, adaptability, beauty, or lineage. The paradox of prestige. Here's the hardest truth to swallow. The empires that empowered some captive women also erased countless others. For every Hurrem who shaped an empire, there were thousands whose names vanished. For every noblewoman ransomed back to her family, there were countless who were never found. For every mother who raised a prince, there were many who raised children in households far from their birthplace and died with no record at all. Captivity could destroy a life. Captivity could elevate a life. Both were true. Both existed side by side. Both were part of the same system. And while these rare rises to power fascinate us today, they shouldn't distract from what happened to the majority, who did not ascend, who did not influence policy, who simply survived and disappeared. Because the real story of conquered cities was not written by queens, it was written by the forgotten. For every captive who rose to influence, thousands more walked a quieter, harsher road, one marked not by power, but by survival. Their stories rarely made it into chronicles because historians wrote about kings, not the vanished. But their fates shaped the emotional landscape of every conquered city. Ransom, the most desperate economy in history. After a conquest, ransom became the first hope, and the most agonizing one. Families sold fields, livestock, heirlooms, and sometimes entire estates to buy back wives or daughters. The wealthiest households had the highest chance, the poor usually had none. In Delhi 1739, Persian officers recorded the names of captives eligible for ransom. Some families bankrupted themselves, borrowing at impossible rates to reclaim kin. Chroniclers describe men standing in line with sacks of coin, praying their loved ones hadn't already been assigned to a household or taken north. In Constantinople, similar scenes unfolded. Urban elites pooled resources, begging Ottoman officers for mercy or purchase rights. Some succeeded, many didn't. Ransom was cruel, not because it was violent, but because it was uncertain. A woman might be alive today, gone tomorrow. Available 1 hour, unavailable the next. It was a race against time, where delay meant disappearance. Relocation. The silent scattering. Not all women were kept in the cities where they were seized. In fact, relocation was common, sometimes voluntary under duress, but usually forced. Ottoman records show captives resettled across Anatolia to repopulate frontier regions. Timurid armies transported women from Persia to Central Asia. Mongol conquest caravans stretched for miles, moving entire populations across continents. Crusaders carried captives back to Europe. These relocations weren't random, they were strategic, to replace populations lost to war, to weaken conquered communities, to supply labor to new territories, to absorb captives into the victor's economy and culture. For the women involved, relocation meant permanent separation from their past. New language, new customs, new names, new families, and often a complete erasure of origin. If you pause the story here, you can almost feel the weight of that silence. Thousands of lives uprooted, moved like grain across the map of a victorious empire. Disappearance, the most common fate. Most women taken in conquest did not join harems, did not rise to court power, and did not return home. They simply vanished into the fabric of the victor's world. Disappearance didn't mean death, though that too happened. It meant assimilation, often under pressure or necessity, into households where their identity blurred and eventually dissolved. A new religion assigned, a husband selected, a child born into the conqueror's lineage, and a name forgotten. Some adapted and built new lives. Some endured lifelong grief. Some found dignity in survival. Some never recovered. But all were changed. And this is where the emotional core of conquest lies, not in the battles, but in the private tragedies that reshaped families for generations. Empires rise. If this were only the story of Constantinople, it would be tragic. If it were only Delhi, it would be devastating. But the truth is far heavier. The pattern repeats across history with chilling consistency. 1453, Constantinople. 3 days of legal plunder. Thousands of women seized, sorted, registered, dispersed, some ransomed, some transported, some absorbed into Ottoman households. Captives divided between ransom and relocation. Noble women hidden in underground chambers for days, praying the soldiers wouldn't find them. 1258, Baghdad. The Mongols end the Abbasid Caliphate. Female captives form enormous caravans marched eastward, some never heard from again. 1209 to Jerusalem. Crusaders breach the walls. What follows is recorded by both sides with horror. Women taken as part of the spoils, the same cycle unfolding under a different cross and sword. 1223, Kiev. Mongol forces storm the city, seize captives and transport many to the steppe. 1380s, Samarkand, Isfahan, Tbilisi. Timur's armies repeat the pattern, again and again, with bureaucratic precision. Different continents, different faiths, different cultures, the same fate. And if you're wondering why this pattern persisted for millennia, the answer is simple and uncomfortable. To the conquerors, women were not just individuals, they were the future of the conquered people. Control the women, and you control the next generation. That cold calculation shaped empires from the shadows, and its echoes still appear in historical lineages, cultural memories, and the quiet stories families refuse to forget. Empires love to celebrate their victories. They carve triumphs into stone. They write epics. They build monuments. But none of those monuments acknowledge the true human cost of conquest, the lives reshaped, not by glory, but by survival. Walk through the ruins of any ancient city, and you can sense it. The stones remember battles, but the silence remembers the women. Their stories rarely survived, yet their impact did. Entire dynasties trace their bloodlines to captives taken in war. Cultures blended because women carried languages across mountains. Religions spread because captives raised children in households far from where they were born. Empires rose through battle, but they were built through the hidden lives of those who endured what came after. So when we look at the great sieges of history, we shouldn't just ask who won, we should ask who survived and what survival cost them. Because conquest isn't just a clash of armies, it's a fracture in human lives, a rupture that ripples out for centuries. a shadow that lingers long after the smoke clears and the chroniclers put down their pens. And in that shadow stands the figure we rarely acknowledge, the woman taken in war, navigating a world rebuilt without her consent. Her name may be lost, her voice may be silent, but her survival shaped empires more than any general's sword. This is the secret fate of the women of conquered cities, a story written not in glory, but in the quiet power of endurance.